The knock came just as the sun dipped low, flooding Skyler's apartment in a wash of gold. It wasn't frantic like the lawyer's endless calls or desperate like Graham's incoherent emails. It was firm, deliberate, the kind of knock that didn't ask, it demanded attention. Skyler froze, coffee mug halfway to her lips. Her first thought was that Graham had escalated, that he'd sent someone. Security. A lawyer with papers. Maybe worse. She set the mug down and moved toward the door, her footsteps soft against the hardwood. When she opened it, she didn't find corporate muscle. She found a man in a blazer, a press badge clipped neatly to his chest. Ms. James. His voice was polite, eager, but controlled. Julian Blake, the Sentinel. Apologies for the intrusion, but I have to ask. He leaned in slightly, lowering his tone. Is it true? Do you really hold the key to the $4.1 billion merger? Behind him, a cameraman lingered at the curb, the lens already trained on her doorway. Skyler steadied her breath. This was the moment she'd dreaded. The line between her quiet war and the public spectacle was blurring. She met Julian's eyes, steel against curiosity. What I hold, she said evenly, is my integrity. And that's not something I'll discuss on the sidewalk. For a moment, Julian's eyes widened, caught between disappointment and respect. He nodded once, stepping back. Fair enough, Ms. James. But understand, his gaze flicked to the camera, then back to her. The world won't stop asking. Skyler closed the door slowly, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. Inside she paced. Her mind replayed the exchange, weighing every word. She hadn't confirmed. She hadn't denied. She'd given the public nothing, and yet her silence had spoken volumes. Already, she could imagine the headlines. Exiled officer refuses to confirm role in billion-dollar merger. The speculation would ignite like gasoline. And with the viral town hall clip still burning through social media, the world would connect the dots. She glanced at her phone. Notifications multiplied by the second. Former colleagues. Old friends. Even distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. Is this really what happened? One text read. I saw the video. He called you trash. Unbelievable. Vindication and unease twisted inside her chest. She had never wanted to be a headline. She had never imagined her humiliation would become fodder for strangers' debates. And yet here she was, her name threaded into news tickers, her silence dissected by analysts in crisp suits. It was surreal, invasive, and strangely empowering. Meanwhile, across the city, Graham's panic was visible to anyone who cared to look. At a hastily arranged press conference, he stepped up to a podium, his face pale, his jaw tight. Cameras clicked. Lights flared. His voice, once booming with confidence, now cracked under pressure. This is a temporary setback, he insisted. A technicality. The merger will proceed as planned. But the market didn't believe him. Investors didn't believe him. And employees who had watched him humiliate Skyler in that glass auditorium certainly didn't believe him. The clip replayed on a loop in news segments. Graham sneering, his voice amplified. You're trash. You're fired. Public outrage sharpened. Comment sections filled with fury. 15 years of service and he humiliates her like that, one viewer wrote. Another, if this is how he treats his own people, why should anyone trust him with billions? The tide was turning, and Graham could feel it dragging him under. Back in her apartment, Skyler's phone buzzed again. This time, not a lawyer, not an investor, but someone she hadn't expected. Carla Jensen. HR. Skyler hesitated before opening the message. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I never wanted to do it that way. Check your inbox. Skyler blinked. She opened her email and found an attachment. A transcript. From inside the boardroom. She scrolled quickly. Graham's voice filled the page, dripping with contempt. She's nothing. Skyler James is nothing. She doesn't matter. And then, Victor Hale's calm, devastating reply. If she's nothing, then why can't we close the deal without her? Skyler stared at the words, her lips curling into the faintest smile. The cracks weren't whispers anymore. They were fissures splitting wide in the heart of Graham's empire. By the time night fell, The pressure was undeniable. News anchors dissected the missing countersignature like it was a murder weapon. Twitter burned with speculation. Investors circled like vultures. And now journalists were at her door. Skyler stood by her window, the city lights flickering against her reflection. For weeks, silence had been her weapon. But with the world closing in, with Ridgewell extending an official offer, with the board considering dragging her back as a consultant, one truth was undeniable. She was no longer invisible. She was the story. And Graham Vexler, the man who had called her trash, was about to learn what happens when the world stops believing your lies. The boardroom at Halloway Systems had always been Graham Vexler's stage. He thrived under the gleam of glass walls, his voice echoing across polished wood, his temper weaponized to silence dissent. But not today. Today, the stage was collapsing beneath him. The directors sat in a semicircle of leather chairs, faces drawn tight, papers spread across the gleaming mahogany table. On the surface, it looked like any other meeting. But the tension was unmistakable. Thick, electric, dangerous. And then Graham exploded. "She's nothing," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "Skyler James is trash. She's manipulating you all. Do you really think she deserves to dictate the future of this company?" His fist slammed down, rattling water glasses, making pens jump across notepads. But the silence that followed wasn't deference. It was disdain. For years, the board had feared him. Now they looked at him the way surgeons look at a patient who's already bleeding out, calculating how much time is left before collapse. It was Victor Hale who finally spoke, his voice calm, deliberate, slicing clean through Graham's rage. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. The legal framework is clear. The countersignature is binding. Whether you like it or not, she is the gatekeeper." The word hit Graham like a bullet. Gatekeeper. His jaw clenched, his face blotched red. "You want to hand this company over to a parasite? To someone who's already been terminated?" But no one moved. No one nodded. For the first time in his career, Graham's bluster fell into a vacuum. Across the city, Skyler sat in her apartment, the transcript glowing on her laptop. Carla Jensen had sent her another leak, an audio recording this time. Skyler hit play. The sound of chairs scraping, the rustle of papers, and then Graham's voice, venomous, frantic, unraveling in real time. "She's trash. She doesn't matter. If you bring her back in any capacity, I walk." And then the silence. A silence so heavy even the recording couldn't capture it fully. Skyler leaned back in her chair, her lips curving just slightly. For 15 years, she had been cut off mid-sentence, ignored, dismissed. Graham had silenced her again and again, believing his voice was the only one that mattered. Now his voice was turning against him. His arrogance was being recorded, transcribed, leaked, and sent directly to her inbox. His power wasn't intimidating anymore. It was pathetic. Meanwhile, the media storm raged hotter. Cable news anchors dissected the meltdown in real time, replaying the viral town hall clip alongside leaked quotes from the boardroom. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Gatekeeper Skyler trended on Twitter. Commentators speculated that her silence wasn't just a refusal to sign, it was a deliberate strategy. And the public loved it. "Trash doesn't sign," one post read, echoing the phrase Skyler had once typed into a draft email and never sent. "Iconic. She played the long game," another wrote. Smartest woman in the room. For the first time, Skyler wasn't just a ghost haunting Graham's empire. She was becoming something bigger, a symbol. Back in the boardroom, desperation clawed at Graham's voice. "You're all overreacting," he snapped. "This is a temporary delay. Investors panic, markets dip, they'll rebound. We don't need her. We never needed her." But one director leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "Our investors have already begun threatening withdrawal. Your refusal to confront reality is costing us millions by the day." Another chimed in sharper. "If we lose Northbridge, we lose everything. And they've already made it clear they don't trust you anymore." The words cut deeper than Skyler's silence ever could. Graham wasn't just battling her now. He was battling gravity, and gravity always wins. In her apartment, Skyler poured another cup of coffee, steam curling into the air. She didn't gloat. She didn't cheer. But for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight shifting in her favor. Her silence had carried her this far. But with every transcript, every leak, every headline, the world was beginning to understand what Graham never had. She mattered. And Graham Vexler, the man who had built an empire on arrogance and cruelty, was finally being crushed by the weight of his own words. By late evening, the leaks had reached critical mass. A major financial outlet published excerpts from the boardroom, including Victor Hale's devastating question, "If she's nothing, then why can't we close the deal without her?" The article went viral within hours. Stock prices nosedived again. Analysts on live television shook their heads in disbelief. "This isn't just a crisis," one said. "It's a collapse in leadership. The man at the top has lost control." Skyler closed her laptop, the glow of the screen fading into darkness. She stood at her window, looking out at the city lights, and for the first time since that humiliating town hall, she felt something like peace. Not triumph. Not revenge. Something steadier. Vindication. The empire that had mocked her was unraveling piece by piece, not because she shouted louder, but because she stayed silent. And tomorrow? Tomorrow she would decide whether silence was enough. The first message came at midnight. No greeting. No signature. Just 5 words, stark against the glow of Skyler's phone. "Stop now, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen, the pulse in her throat quickening. For weeks, she had received pleading emails, frantic voicemails, offers dressed in corporate diplomacy. But this was different. This was a warning. A threat. Skyler set the phone down, her fingers steady even as her stomach turned. She wasn't naive. She had known this would come. When power shifts, desperation follows. And desperate men, especially men like Graham Vexler, don't fight fair. By morning, the threat had multiplied. Another email. Then another. Anonymous senders, cloaked addresses. Each one sharper than the last. "Walk away. You think silence protects you? It won't. Accidents happen." Skyler deleted none of them. She kept them all, dragging each into a private folder labeled simply, "Proof." She poured herself coffee, the bitterness grounding her. Fear wanted to claw its way in, but she refused it. She had lived in fear once, of being silenced, of being mocked, of being dismissed. That fear had already cost her too much. Now, fear had no place here. A knock at her door startled her. She tensed, half expecting another reporter, maybe even someone sent by Graham. But when she opened it, she found Daniel Cho. The young lawyer shifted nervously, his tie askew, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "I shouldn't be here," he admitted. "But I had to." Skyler stepped aside, letting him in. Daniel paced her living room like a man carrying dynamite. "I saw the clause that night," he blurted. 2 years ago. Section 14. I caught it, but Graham shut me down. I should have pushed harder. I didn't." And now, he trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. Now he's coming apart, and people around him, they're dangerous when they're cornered. Skyler studied him, her smoky blonde bob catching the light. "You're saying the threats. They're real," Daniel cut in. "I've seen how far Graham will go to protect himself. He's not just fighting for the deal. He's fighting for his survival. If this merger collapses, so does he. He'll burn the company down before he lets you win." Skyler crossed her arms, her expression cool, unshaken. "Then he's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet." Daniel looked at her, almost stunned. "You're not afraid?" "Of Graham?" she asked. "No." "Of what he's capable of?" "Yes. But fear doesn't dictate my choices anymore." Across town, Graham's fury reached a fever pitch. Leaked accounts painted the picture vividly. Him storming down hallways, cursing employees who wouldn't meet his eyes, threatening directors who dared question him. One insider described him as a drowning man, dragging everyone down with him. The threats against Skyler weren't random. They were calculated, a desperate attempt to rattle her, to force her to fold before the clock struck again. But Skyler didn't fold. Instead, she began documenting everything. The emails, the voicemails, even the knock she swore she heard at 3 a.m., though no one had been there when she checked. Every piece was fuel, evidence, insurance. Because Skyler had learned long ago that survival wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being prepared when the floor gave way. Daniel stayed late into the evening, recounting details from the boardroom that made Skyler's blood run cold. Graham screaming about betrayal, investors threatening to walk, directors whispering about replacing him. He's unraveling, Daniel said quietly. But when men like him unravel, they don't collapse quietly. They lash out. Skyler nodded. She knew. She had seen it before, in smaller ways, in private meetings, in the way Graham ridiculed anyone who dared challenge him. But this was different. This was bigger. Now the whole world was watching. That night, as the city glowed outside her window, Skyler opened her laptop and drafted a single line into a blank email. Trash doesn't sign. She stared at the words, her fingers hovering over the send button. They weren't for Graham. They were for her. A reminder. A declaration. Proof that she hadn't forgotten who she was, or what he had called her. She didn't send it. She never intended to. Instead, she saved the draft and closed the window. The message didn't need to leave her outbox to matter. Its power wasn't in being delivered. Its power was in existing. The threats didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. But so did the cracks in Graham's empire. Investors sharpened their knives. The media feasted on every leak. Employees whispered in hallways, their loyalty eroding by the hour. And in the shadows of it all, Skyler stood steady. Because she knew something Graham never would. You can't intimidate someone who's already been humiliated in front of 1,000 people and survived. Silence had protected her. Silence had shifted the balance. And now, silence was about to bury him. The 10th morning arrived with a weight that pressed against every corner of Skyler's apartment. Her phone buzzed non-stop on the table. Emails, missed calls, notifications stacked like falling dominoes. For days she had let it all wash over her, letting silence do the damage Graham never saw coming. But today felt different. Today, silence wasn't enough. Skyler wrapped her hands around a mug of fresh coffee, the steam curling into the air. She stared at the unopened box by the door, the one that held her 15 years of service reduced to framed photos and a chipped mug. For weeks, that box had been a symbol of exile. But now it was something else, proof that Graham Vexler had underestimated the wrong woman. Her laptop chimed with a new email. Subject line: final reminder, counter-signature required. Skyler opened it. Lawyers pleaded in polished language, citing deadlines, threatening regulatory collapse, warning of billions evaporating. She read each line calmly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Every word confirmed what she already knew. Graham's empire stood on the edge, and the push was hers to give. She closed the email without replying. Instead, she opened the folder she had labeled proof. Inside sat weeks of documentation. The threats, the transcripts, the voicemails, every shred of evidence that painted Graham Vexler not as a leader, but as a tyrant unraveling in real time. She scrolled slowly, her finger pausing over the audio recording from the boardroom the moment Graham roared, "She's nothing. She doesn't matter." And then Victor Hale's devastating reply, "If she's nothing, then why can't we close the deal without her?" Skyler leaned back, exhaling. She had stayed silent long enough. It was time to let the world hear what the board had already heard. By mid-afternoon, a new story broke. A recording leaked to the press. Graham's voice filled living rooms, car radios, and phone screens across the country. His venom was impossible to miss. "She's nothing. Skyler James is trash." But this time, the world didn't hear arrogance. They heard desperation. Anchors replayed the clip with grim expressions. Analysts shook their heads. Social media exploded. Hashtag Gatekeeper Skyler surged again, joined now by a new hashtag, hashtag Trash Doesn't Sign. The phrase Skyler had once typed into a private draft email, her reminder, her anchor, had escaped into the wild. It burned across the internet, trending, spreading, turning into a rallying cry. Trash doesn't sign. Iconic. She held her ground. Respect. This is what corporate justice looks like. Skyler hadn't released the phrase herself. She hadn't needed to. Somewhere, someone close enough to her story had carried it into the storm, and now it was everywhere. Inside Halloway Systems, chaos was absolute. Graham stormed through hallways, barking orders, demanding to know who leaked the recording. His voice cracked, his hands shook, his confidence fractured in full view of the people he once commanded. In the boardroom, directors whispered about contingency plans. Some argued for replacing him immediately. Others discussed negotiating directly with Skyler, bypassing him altogether. And investors? Investors were sharpening their knives. Northbridge Capital had already called for an emergency review. Ridgewell Partners issued a public statement, praising Ms. James's professionalism and foresight. The market heard the subtext loud and clear. They were siding with her. Graham was being isolated, cornered. And Skyler hadn't even stepped into the room. That evening, Daniel Cho returned to Skyler's apartment. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed. "You did it," he said, dropping into a chair. Skyler raised a brow. "I didn't release anything." "You didn't have to," Daniel replied. "It's out. The board's in open revolt. Investors are circling." "Graham," he shook his head. "He's done." Skyler studied him for a moment, then turned back to the window where the city lights flickered like sparks. "He's not done until he knows it," she said quietly. "And men like Graham, they don't accept endings gracefully." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "That's what worries me. Desperate men don't go quietly." Skyler met his eyes, her expression steady. "Neither do I." Later that night, as the news cycle spun faster and hashtags flared across social media, Skyler opened her laptop one last time. She pulled up the draft she had saved days earlier. "Trash doesn't sign." The words glowed against the screen. A phrase never meant to be shared, now burned into the culture like a scar. Skyler hovered over the delete key. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed it. The words had done their job. They had carried her through the storm. But Graham's downfall didn't need her private reminder anymore. His downfall was now written across every screen, every headline, every boardroom whisper. She closed the laptop, poured herself another coffee, and raised the mug toward the window. Somewhere downtown, Graham was fighting for oxygen, clawing against inevitability. But here, in the quiet of her apartment, Skyler James finally allowed herself to feel it. Liberation. Not loud. Not vengeful. Steady. Unshakable. The fight wasn't over. But she had already won. By the time the 11th day dawned, Graham Vexler was no longer a CEO. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. The stock had cratered. Investors were circling like vultures, and employees whispered his name like a curse. But Graham wasn't the type to accept defeat. He had one card left, and he was reckless enough to play it. It began with a message delivered to Skyler's inbox. Short. Direct. Personal. "Meet me. One last time. 7 p.m. boardroom. No lawyers. No directors. Just him." Skyler read it twice, then a third time. Her instincts screamed trap, but her mind saw something else. Desperation. A drowning man grabbing for the last piece of driftwood. Daniel Cho sat across from her kitchen table, scanning the message over her shoulder. "Don't go," he said flatly. "He's cornered. And cornered men do stupid things." Skyler sipped her coffee, her expression unreadable. "Exactly. That's why I need to see him. Not to give him what he wants, but to watch him fall." Daniel shook his head, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to tell Skyler James when to stay silent. The boardroom was nearly empty when she arrived that evening. No assistants. No investors. Just the echo of her heels against polished wood and Graham Vexler at the far end of the table. He looked different. Not the booming tyrant of the town hall. Not the smooth operator who once charmed investors. His suit hung wrinkled, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. "Skyler," he said, his voice hoarse but sharp with defiance. "You win. You made your point. But this," he slammed a folder onto the table. "This is bigger than both of us. You sign, and the company lives. You refuse, and thousands lose their jobs. You'll be the villain, not me." Skyler approached slowly, her blonde bob catching the overhead light. She didn't sit. She didn't even touch the folder. "You called me trash in front of 998 people," she said softly, her voice steady enough to slice glass. "You called me a parasite. And now you want me to save you." Graham's jaw tightened. "It's not about me. It's about them. The employees. The investors. The legacy of this company. Do you really want to burn it all down just to spite me?" Skyler leaned forward, her palms resting lightly on the table. "This company isn't collapsing because of me, Graham. It's collapsing because of you. Your arrogance. Your cruelty. Your refusal to listen." For a moment, his mask cracked. His eyes flickered with something raw fear. Then anger rushed back in to fill the void. "Sign it," he hissed. "Or I'll make sure the world remembers you as the woman who destroyed everything." Skyler straightened, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You already made sure the world remembered me. The day you humiliated me in front of them. The day you forgot your mic was still live." At that exact moment, the boardroom door opened. Victor Hale stepped inside, flanked by two other directors. Their faces were grim, their movements deliberate. "Mr. Vexler," Hale said calmly, "this meeting isn't private anymore." Graham spun around, rage flaring. "You can't do this." But Hale cut him off, his tone sharper than steel. "We already have. Effective immediately, the board is calling for an emergency vote of no confidence." The words landed like a hammer. Graham staggered, his face pale. "You can't." But the look in the director's eyes told him everything. They weren't afraid of him anymore. They weren't protecting him. They were finished. Skyler didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her silence louder than any victory speech she could deliver. For 15 years, Graham had silenced her, dismissed her, mocked her. And now, in the room where he once reigned, she didn't have to say a word. His empire was collapsing in real time, and her silence was the soundtrack. Victor Hale turned to her, his voice respectful in a way she had never heard in these walls. "Ms. James, would you excuse us? The board will handle this from here." Skyler met his gaze, then glanced back at Graham. His shoulders slumped, his arrogance drained, his kingdom burning around him. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked out, her heels striking the floor like a drumbeat of finality. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Ms. James, did you meet with Graham? Will you sign the merger? Are you the reason the deal collapsed?" Skyler paused at the top of the stairs, the chaos swirling around her. For the first time, she didn't feel the sting of their questions. She felt steady, whole. She lifted her chin, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "I have nothing to add tonight." And with that, she walked into the flashing storm, leaving Graham Vexler behind to drown in the ruins he had built. The morning after the boardroom showdown, the world woke up to headlines that read like obituaries. Halloway Systems CEO ousted after no confidence vote. Merger collapse sparks leadership crisis. Trash doesn't sign becomes rallying cry. News anchors wore solemn expressions as they recapped the implosion. Investors dissected the numbers, employees whispered in office hallways, and social media exploded with commentary. The viral town hall clip, replayed alongside fresh footage of Graham leaving headquarters under the glare of cameras, his face pale, his jaw clenched, his empire gone. The man who had once sneered in front of nearly 1,000 employees, calling Skyler James trash, was now reduced to a footnote in the story of his own downfall. And Skyler? She was no longer invisible. She was everywhere. Her phone buzzed constantly with requests, interviews, speaking engagements, corporate offers. Some were opportunistic, others genuine. But one email stood out from the noise. Subject: Invitation, Senior Advisor Role. It was from Ridgewell Partners. The same rival company that had once pleaded for her signature now offered her more than a seat at the table. They offered authority. "Ms. James," the letter read, "we believe your expertise, foresight, and integrity are exactly what this industry needs. We would be honored to welcome you as a senior advisor, with full autonomy to oversee compliance and strategic negotiations. You will not be silenced here." Skyler read it twice, then a third time. The word settled in her chest like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying, now lifting. For 15 years she had built her career only to be mocked, dismissed, humiliated. And now, the rival Graham had tried to dominate was offering her everything he had denied her, respect. She closed her laptop, letting the offer sit. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel rushed. Power wasn't running away from her anymore. It was waiting. Meanwhile, Graham's world continued to collapse. Investors who once cheered his bravado now called for his resignation. Directors who once laughed at his jokes now whispered about criminal investigations. His arrogance had turned toxic, and no one wanted to breathe it in anymore. Skyler watched it unfold on television, not with joy, not with vengeance, but with quiet satisfaction. Graham had built his empire on cruelty, and cruelty had been his undoing. She hadn't destroyed him. He had destroyed himself. All she had done was refuse to sign. That evening, she finally unpacked the cardboard box that had sat untouched by her door. One by one, she placed her framed photos back on her shelves, her coffee mug on the counter, her books in their place. For weeks, that box had been a symbol of exile. Tonight, it was something else entirely, proof that she had carried her dignity out of that building intact. Among the files at the bottom of the box, she found the thick binder again, the merger draft, her claws inked into its bones. She ran her fingers over the page where her counter-signature lines still sat blank. Waiting. Silent. She smiled faintly. Not today, she whispered. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't a lawyer or a journalist. It was Daniel Cho. I heard the board voted him out, he said. His voice carried both relief and exhaustion. They did, Skyler confirmed. You know, Daniel added softly, when I saw that clause 2 years ago, I thought you were just protecting the company. I didn't realize you were protecting yourself, too. Skyler leaned back, her lips curving. I was protecting both. Turns out, one saved the other. Daniel hesitated, then said, What are you going to do now? Skyler looked out at the city skyline, glowing against the night. She didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. Because whatever she chose, she knew one thing for certain. She would never be silenced again. Later, as the city buzzed beneath her balcony, Skyler lifted a glass of wine to the night. She thought of the town hall, the sting of humiliation, the word trash echoing in her ears. She thought of the silence that followed, the colleagues too afraid to speak, the cardboard box in her arms. And then she thought of the moment the clock struck 5, when silence toppled an empire. Justice hadn't roared. It had whispered. And sometimes, whispers are louder than thunder. Skyler raised her glass higher, a silent toast to everyone who had ever been underestimated, discarded, humiliated. To the ones who walk away quietly, only to return with power no one saw coming. Her lips curved into a steady smile. Trash doesn't sign, she murmured. And with that, she turned back inside. Not broken, not discarded, but free. Liberated. In the end, Graham Vexler didn't lose because of contracts, investors, or boardroom politics. He lost because he believed cruelty was power. Skyler James proved him wrong. She didn't shout. She didn't fight on his terms. She simply stood her ground, let silence sharpen into a blade, and waited. And when the time came, that silence cut deeper than any outburst ever could. The man who once humiliated her in front of nearly 1,000 people was stripped of everything, while the woman he called trash walked away with dignity, respect, and the power to choose her future. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. And for Skyler James, that whisper became...
Thanks for watching.